Somewhere beneath the southern suburbs of Rome, in a tunnel system that extends for miles through the volcanic rock beneath the Appian Way, there is a room that was used as a place of worship for a community of people who could not worship publicly. The room dates to approximately the late 2nd or early 3rd century of the Common Era, somewhere around 200 CE, give or take a generation. On its walls, painted in the fresco technique that Roman artists had been using for centuries, is an image of a young man. He is beardless, his hair is short, cropped close to the head in the style that Roman men of the era wore when they wanted to appear respectable rather than divine or barbarian. He is dressed in a Roman tunic and pallium. He holds a wand, and he is performing a miracle. The specific narrative context of the image, recognizable to any member of the worshiping community who, gathered in this room, identifies him as Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. But if you removed the narrative of context and showed the image to someone who did not already know what it depicted, nothing about the young man's physical appearance would identify him as anything other than an ordinary Roman citizen of the early imperial period. This is the oldest surviving artistic tradition for the depiction of Jesus Christ. Not the long-haired, bearded figure that 1.5 billion Christians worldwide carry in their minds as the face of their Savior. A short-haired, clean, shaven young man who looks like a Roman. The paintings depict Jesus as the Good Shepherd, a young, short-haired, beardless man with a lamb around his shoulders. In fresco after fresco, across multiple catacomb systems beneath. Rome, across the first 3 centuries of Christian art, the image is consistent. Jesus is young, Jesus has short hair, Jesus is beardless, Jesus looks Roman. And then, across the 4th and 5th centuries, following one of the most consequential political transformations in the history of the Western world, he is replaced by someone else. A long-haired, full-bearded figure of imposing authority, whose visual vocabulary is drawn not from any historical record of what Jesus looked like, but from the artistic conventions that Greco-Roman civilization used to depict its gods. The story of how this transformation happened, and what AI synthesis of the complete evidence base produces when asked what Jesus actually looked like before the transformation, is one of the most revealing case studies in the history of visual culture and its relationship to historical truth. Begin with what the evidence of 1st century Palestine actually tells us about the physical appearance of Jewish men of Jesus' time and region. The question is not unanswerable. It has specific, well-evidenced answers that the historical and archaeological record provides across several independent lines of evidence. The skeletal record from archaeological excavations of 1st century Jewish burial sites in and around Jerusalem and Galilee is the most direct evidence. The skeletal remains of men from this period and population are consistent across sites, an average height of approximately 5 feet 1 inch to 5 feet 2 inches, significantly shorter than modern European averages, bone structure consistent with manual labor, a physical type that modern genetic and anthropological research places within the ancient Levantine Semitic population, whose skin tone, hair type, and facial structure are consistent with what is now called olive to medium brown complexion, dark hair typically curly or wavy, and dark eyes. The DNA evidence from ancient Levantine populations, the same genetic research that has been transforming our understanding of Bronze Age and Iron Age population history across the Middle East, confirms what the skeletal morphology shows. The ancient Jewish population of Roman-era Palestine was a Levantine Semitic population with deep roots in the region. No significant genetic contribution from Northern or Western European populations, and an appearance consistent with modern populations of similar genetic background in the same geographic region, which is to say, dark-skinned, dark-eyed, dark-haired, with the facial structure characteristic of Eastern Mediterranean populations. The Roman textual record adds another dimension. Roman writers of the 1st and early 2nd century describing encounters with Jewish populations or with followers of Jesus do not remark on any unusual physical appearance. This is actually significant, evidence in itself. Roman writers were not shy about describing the physical appearance of people they found notable or unusual. The literature is full of comments about the appearance of Gauls, Germans, Ethiopians, Persians, and other peoples who presented unusual physical features to Roman eyes. The conspicuous absence of any comment about Jesus or his followers looking unusual or foreign confirms that they presented an entirely ordinary Mediterranean appearance to the Roman observers who encountered them and wrote about the early Christian movement. The specific biblical details that touch on Jesus' appearance, read carefully, converge on the same picture. Isaiah 53:2, which the Christian theological tradition interprets as a prophecy about the suffering servant who would be identified with Jesus, states, "He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him." This is, for the purposes of the appearance question, a specifically useful description because it explicitly rules out the kind of striking, commanding, unusual physical appearance that tradition has sometimes attributed to Jesus, The passage says plainly that there was nothing visually distinctive about this person that would draw the eye or inspire admiration based on appearance alone. The Gethsemane episode, already discussed in other contexts, bears repeating here because of what it tells us about Jesus' physical distinctiveness within his own group. Judas Iscariot, who had been with Jesus for years, who had traveled with him, eaten with him, and presumably knew his face well enough to recognize it in any ordinary context, needed to walk up to Jesus and kiss him to identify him to the arresting soldiers. This detail makes no narrative sense. If Jesus had any visually distinguishing feature that would have made him immediately recognizable in a group of men who presumably all shared his general regional background. The kiss was necessary precisely because Jesus looked like everyone else in the group. He was physically a typical Galilean Jewish man, which is what the forensic anthropological reconstruction confirms. The hair question is particularly interesting because it is one of the most starkly contradicted elements of the traditional artistic depiction. Men in the first century rarely had long hair. It was considered either godly or girly. The cultural context of first century Palestine, like the broader Hellenistic Roman world in which it was embedded, associated long hair in men with either divine figures, gods were often depicted with flowing hair in Greek and Roman art, or with those who were considered effeminate by the prevailing standards of masculine presentation. For a first century Jewish man who was trying to be taken seriously as a teacher and rabbi, as the Gospels consistently present Jesus, wearing long hair would have been an immediately noticed and culturally coded choice. More importantly, it would almost certainly have been noted and described in sources from the period. The silence in the historical record on this point is itself evidence. If Jesus had worn his hair long, it would have been as notable and as commented upon as any other unusual choice of personal presentation. The early Christian textual tradition is even more direct on this point. The Pauline letters that represent our earliest surviving Christian documents specifically describe long hair as a disgrace for men. The relevant passage in 1 Corinthians, written by Paul approximately 20 years after the crucifixion to a community many of whose members would have had direct or near direct knowledge of what Jesus looked like, states plainly that it is shameful for a man to wear long hair. This would be a peculiar statement to make in a community founded by a man famously known for wearing long hair. The passage is entirely consistent with a community in which the founder's actual hair length was unremarkable and entirely inconsistent with the tradition that made long hair a defining visual marker of Jesus' appearance for the following 17 centuries. The beard question is less clear-cut. Beards were common among first-century Jewish men, consistent with the prevailing cultural practice in the region, though not universal. The artistic tradition of Jesus with a beard is not implausible in the way that the long hair tradition is, but the full, flowing, carefully maintained beard of Byzantine and Renaissance iconography, the beard that communicates philosophical gravitas and divine authority, is a different object from the working beard of a Galilean carpenter, and the distinction matters when evaluating how accurately the artistic tradition represents historical reality. The visual representation of Jesus has undergone significant evolution over centuries, reflecting shifts in theological emphasis, political messages, cultural influences, and artistic traditions. The shift from the beardless, short-haired Jesus of the 3rd century catacombs to the long-haired, bearded Christ Pantocrator of Byzantine iconography is one of the most consequential visual transformations in the history of human culture, and it happened not because of new information about what Jesus looked like, but because of a political and institutional transformation that changed the context in which images of Jesus were produced and the purposes they were required to serve. Byzantine images of Jesus were based on the image of a Greco-Roman deity. For example, the famous statue of Olympian Zeus by Phidias in the 4th century BCE. This huge statue was located inside the temple of Zeus at Olympia in Greece and depicted a long-haired and bearded Zeus on a throne. The Zeus of Olympia was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a massive chryselephantine statue of gold and ivory approximately 12 meters tall that had been the most famous single work of art in the Hellenistic world for 8 centuries by the time Christian iconographers were developing the image of Christ. Its visual vocabulary, long hair, full beard, seated authority, was so deeply embedded in the cultural imagination of the Mediterranean world that any image intended to convey divine power and authority would naturally draw from it. Not through deliberate deception, but through the simple fact that artistic vocabulary is inherited from the tradition one works within, and the tradition that 4th and 5th century Christian artists worked within was the Hellenistic Roman tradition whose conventions for depicting the divine were well established and universally recognized. The long hair and beard became standardized in Christian art by the 4th century, influenced by Greco-Roman depictions of philosophers, gods, and rulers, such as Zeus or Serapis, symbolizing wisdom and divinity. Serapis was a syncretic. deity created under the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, combining features of Osiris and Zeus, and typically depicted with long, flowing hair and a full beard. His iconography was among the most widely disseminated in the ancient Mediterranean world in the centuries before and after the Common Era's beginning. The visual type of the long-haired, full-bearded divine or semi-divine figure was, by the 4th century, so familiar and so culturally loaded with associations of wisdom, authority, and transcendent power that it was the natural visual vocabulary for artists, commissioned to create authoritative images of a figure they wanted audiences to recognize as divine and authoritative. The specific political moment that drove this transformation was Constantine's conversion to Christianity in the early 4th century and the subsequent elevation of Christianity from a persecuted minority religion to the official religion of the Roman Empire. Before Constantine, Christian communities worshipped in private homes and underground spaces, and their art served devotional and narrative purposes for an audience that already knew the story and needed no grand visual claims about divine authority to sustain its faith. After Constantine, Christian art was required to serve a different function, to project the power and authority of a state religion to populations across a vast empire who might be encountering Christian imagery for the first time, and who would recognize divine authority only in the visual vocabulary they already knew. The beardless, short-haired Good Shepherd of the catacombs served a community of insiders. The long-haired, bearded Christ Pantocrator served a state religion speaking to outsiders through the visual language of imperial power. And the image that served state power is the image that survived, that was reproduced across centuries, transmitted through the Church's institutional continuity, absorbed into the devotional lives of billions of people, and eventually became more real in the global imagination than any historical reconstruction. Richard Neve's forensic reconstruction, used for the BBC documentary Son of God in 2001, employed an Israeli skull from the 1st century. Neve and his team of forensic anthropologists used computer modeling and anthropological data on Jewish populations to produce a likeness of what Jesus might have looked like, though it represented a generic individual rather than a portrait of the historical figure himself. The qualification matters. Neve was not claiming to have produced a portrait of Jesus specifically. He was producing the face of a typical 1st century Galilean Jewish man. Oh, the face of the population that Jesus belonged to, from which Jesus would not have been visually distinguishable. And that face, produced by the most rigorous forensic methodology available, looks nothing like the image that 17 centuries of art embedded in the global imagination. The broader picture that AI synthesis produces when asked to integrate all of this evidence, the skeletal record, the genetic data, the Roman textual record, the catacomb art tradition, the Pauline hair evidence, the Gethsemane identification problem, the art historical transformation, and the forensic reconstruction, is a coherent and convergent picture. The Jesus of the forensic and historical evidence is short, dark, broad-faced, short-haired, with a beard that is probably present, but probably not the flowing display of the artistic tradition. He is a working man, physically shaped by the manual labor of carpentry, standing at the average height of his population. He is entirely typical of his time and place, which is, as the evidence has consistently suggested, precisely the point. He was someone who could move through Galilee and Jerusalem without standing out. Someone who, in a garden at night, was not visually distinguishable from 11 other men who had been walking the same roads with him. When AI systems are asked today to synthesize this evidence and produce a description of what Jesus looked like, the description is consistent with what the early catacomb artists painted, and consistent with what Richard Neve reconstructed, and consistent with what the historical and biblical evidence has always suggested. The image that shocks people when they encounter it, the dark, ordinary short-haired man, is shocking, not because it is unexpected from the evidence. It is shocking because of what we have been carrying in its place. An image that was never built on evidence, that was built on the visual vocabulary of Greco-Roman divine authority applied to a Galilean, carpenter by artists who had no historical information about what he looked like and who worked within the only artistic tradition available to them. The faces in the catacombs below Rome, painted in the early 3rd century, are closer to the evidence than anything produced after them. They show a young man in Roman clothes with short hair and no beard, performing miracles, and looking exactly like everyone else around him. That is probably the most honest portrait that Christian art has ever produced of the historical Jesus, and it is the portrait that was replaced by the God image, the Zeus-derived, authority-projecting, visually commanding Pantocrator that has been the face of Jesus for 17 centuries. The AI synthesis does not produce something new. It returns us to something old, to what the evidence said before the art replaced the evidence with convention, and convention became, for most of the people who have ever lived within the reach of Christian iconographic tradition, more real than anything the evidence could have shown. Subscribe. Because the oldest images of Jesus are the honest ones, and understanding why they were replaced is one of the most revealing stories in the history of power and image making.